At 10:30 a.m. on April 7, 1943, First Lieutenant James Sweat looked out over the blue expanse around Guadalcanal and saw the sky coming apart. Japanese aircraft were streaming in from the northwest, so many that, at first, his mind refused to accept the number. Sweat was 22 years old. He had logged 197 hours in the Grumman F-4F Wildcat. This was his first combat mission. The formation rushing toward the island was enormous. 67 Aichi Val dive bombers wrapped in the protection of more than 100 fighters. It was the largest Japanese air raid mounted since Midway, 9 months earlier. Marine Fighter Squadron VMF 221 had been on Guadalcanal for just over 2 months. Since arriving, Sweat had flown nothing but routine patrols, endless circles over water and jungle, no enemy contact, no shots fired. Even that morning had been uneventful. He had already completed 2 patrols without seeing so much as a distant contrail. When the scramble order came at 10:20, Sweat assumed it would be another waste of fuel and adrenaline. Intelligence chatter had increased, but it always did. Japanese radios lit up, radar showed ghosts, fighters launched, and found nothing. False alarms were part of life on Guadalcanal. This time, they were wrong. His division commander was Captain Joseph Foss, already a legend among the Marines with 26 confirmed kills. Foss led 4 Wildcats off Henderson Field, banking into a climbing turn toward the northwest. Sweat tucked in behind him. They had roughly 15 minutes before the bombers reached the Allied ships anchored off Tulagi. At 8,000 feet, Sweat finally saw the truth. The sky ahead was crowded with aircraft, layered and moving with terrifying purpose. He counted 15 Val bombers in the lead formation alone. Behind them, more groups stretched back toward the horizon. Above the bombers, Zero fighters orbited at least 3,000 feet higher, watching for interceptors. The numbers were absurd. 37 Japanese aircraft for every American fighter airborne. 4 Wildcats against 150 enemy planes. The F-4F, 4 Wildcat was no match for the Zero on paper. It topped out at 318 miles per hour at altitude. The Zero could reach 350 and climb faster by 1,500 feet per minute. But the Wildcat had one saving grace. It was brutally tough. It could take punishment that would tear lighter fighters apart. And at close range, its 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns were lethal. Each gun carried 240 rounds. Sweat had 1,440 rounds total, enough for 24 seconds of uninterrupted fire if he held the trigger down. 24 seconds to live or die. He ran a final check. Oil pressure steady. Fuel good for about an hour. He flipped the gun sight power switch. The illuminated pipper bloomed into view on the reflector glass, perfectly centered. He armed the master switch. The charging handles had already been pulled. 6 guns loaded, chambers hot. He had never fired them at another airplane. Foss angled the division into a head-on attack on the lead bomber group. The Val dive bombers were already tipping over, beginning their dives toward the transports clustered in Tulagi Harbor. Sweat followed Foss down through 8,000 feet, the altimeter unwinding fast. At 400 yards, Foss fired. Red tracers streaked out and walked into the lead Val. Its engine detonated in a sudden orange flash. The bomber pitched violently and fell straight down, vanishing into the water below. Sweat picked the next Val in line. 350 yards. Closing rapidly, he settled the pipper over the cockpit and squeezed the trigger. The Wildcat bucked as all 6 machine guns opened at once. Brass casings poured from the wing ports. The Val's canopy exploded outward, shards flashing in the sun. The bomber flipped inverted and dropped away trailing smoke, his first kill. He shifted immediately to another target and fired a short burst. The left wing tore free at the root. The aircraft disintegrated as it fell. 2 kills in less than 40 seconds. A Zero screamed down from above. Sweat snapped the stick right. The Japanese fighter missed him by less than 10 feet, a gray blur crossing his canopy. Sweat rolled into a hard climbing turn, muscles straining as the G-forces crushed him into the seat. When he leveled out, the sky had changed again. The formation was gone. His division had been ripped apart by the chaos of the first pass. Foss was nowhere in sight. Other Wildcats were scattered across the airspace, each locked in its own desperate fight. James Sweat was alone. Below him, the surviving Val dive bombers pressed on, their noses dropping toward the ships anchored around Tulagi. Sweat didn't hesitate. He shoved the stick forward and rolled into a steep dive after them. The Wildcat accelerated violently. The airspeed needle swept past 400 miles per hour, faster than the aircraft was ever meant to go. The controls stiffened as the airflow hammered the wings and tail. Sweat fought the pressure, lining up on the nearest valve as it steadied for its attack run. He fired a short, controlled burst. The bomber vanished in a flash of flame and debris. 3 kills in less than 6 minutes. Sweat hauled back on the stick and pulled out of the dive at 2,000 feet, his body straining against the G-forces. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat, but his hands stayed calm, steady. The drills, the endless training flights, the muscle memory, it was all working. He scanned the sky. Above him, another formation of Val bombers was assembling, 15 aircraft, arranged in 3 tight V-shaped elements of 5 each. They were lining up for their bombing run, completely focused on the ships below. They hadn't seen him. Sweat climbed hard back to 6,000 feet, positioning himself above and slightly behind the trailing aircraft in the first group. The sun sat squarely at his back, blinding anyone who might glance up too late. It was the textbook setup instructors talked about, but few pilots ever achieved in real combat. He rolled over and dove straight down. At 200 yards, he squeezed the trigger and held it. For seconds, nearly 300 rounds. The .50 caliber fire tore into the valve's tail section. Metal disintegrated under the concentrated impact. The bomber snapped into an uncontrolled spin, shedding pieces as it fell, and slammed into the ocean in a streak of smoke and spray. For kills. A quick glance at the ammo counter told him he had already burned through roughly 600 rounds. Half his ammunition was gone. 840 rounds remained. 14 seconds of fire, at most. There was no time to think about it. Sweat swung left, using the excess speed from his dive to slice directly through the second bomber formation. He picked the closest valve, centered the glowing pipper, and fired. The aircraft detonated midair. The bomb it carried exploded, magnifying the blast into a violent fireball that flung fragments across the sky. 5 kills in 9 minutes. The remaining bombers in that group broke apart instantly. Some jettisoned their bombs to gain speed and turned north toward Rabaul. Others, whether driven by orders or sheer determination, continued their dives toward the ships. Sweat stayed with them. His 6th kill came seconds later. A Val trying to escape at low altitude toward the Florida Islands. Sweat dropped in behind it, closing to 150 yards, the perfect firing distance. His tracers marched up the fuselage and punched into the fuel tank. The bomber erupted in flame and cartwheeled into the water. 6 kills. Now his ammunition was truly running low. Perhaps 400 rounds left. 6 or 7 seconds of firing time, no more. He pulled up hard, searching the sky for another target. There was no sign of his wingmen. The radio was a wall of noise. Overlapping calls, shouted warnings, pilots yelling positions, and threats all at once. It was impossible to make sense of. Below him, Allied ships were fighting for their lives. Anti-aircraft fire filled the air. 5-inch guns hurled proximity-fused shells that burst near incoming aircraft. Quad-mounted 40mm Bofors tracked targets relentlessly. 20mm Oerlikons stitched the sky with glowing tracers. Black flak bursts blossomed everywhere. Then Sweat saw another Val rolling into its dive toward the cargo ships near Gavutu. He rolled inverted and pulled through into a split S. The negative GS were savage. Blood rushed to his head. His vision dimmed at the edges. His helmet pressed hard against the canopy as gravity tried to rip him out of the seat. He forced his eyes to stay open, tracking the Val through the gun sight as both aircraft plunged toward the harbor. 5,000 feet. 4,000. 3. The Val's rear gunner opened fire. Sweat saw the muzzle flashes before he felt anything. Tracers whipped past his canopy, so close he flinched. At 1,000 feet, Sweat fired. A short burst. 2 seconds. Perhaps 130 rounds. The Val's engine ignited instantly. Thick black smoke poured from the cowling as the bomber lost control and slammed into the water near Gavutu Island, throwing up a towering column of spray. 7 kills in 12 minutes. Sweat yanked the Wildcat out of the dive just 300 feet above the water. The altimeter barely moved. The needle hovered almost at 0. Directly beneath him, transport ships filled the harbor, still afloat, still fighting. And the battle was far from over. He had dropped straight into the heart of the fleet's defensive fire, the most lethal airspace anywhere over the Sound. Every gun on every ship below was firing flat out. At this altitude and speed, no one could tell American fighters from Japanese bombers. To the gunners, he was simply another aircraft crossing the sights. Then he saw it. Above him, one more valve rolled over and began its dive, another bomber committing to an attack run. An eighth possible kill. Sweat checked what remained of his ammunition. Perhaps 250 rounds. 3, maybe 4 seconds of fire. Enough for one last attempt. He pulled back on the stick and climbed after the valve, but something was wrong. The Wildcat felt heavy, sluggish. The response wasn't right. He glanced down at the gauges. Everything read normal. Then the aircraft was hit. A violent udar slammed into the left wing. The Wildcat lurched sideways, snapping hard to port. Sweat instinctively jammed full right aileron and rudder, fighting to keep the aircraft level. He twisted in his seat and looked out at the wing. A massive hole yawned in the metal, easily 2 feet across. The skin was torn back like jagged paper. A 40mm Bofors shell had punched clean through. Friendly fire. One of the ships he had been defending had just hit him. Fuel streamed from the ruptured tank, atomizing into a pale vapor trail behind the aircraft. The Wildcat was still flying, but only just. The torn wing created brutal drag. His airspeed bled away by the second. Altitude followed. The valve he had been chasing simply pulled away. Sweat fired anyway. A long, desperate burst emptied nearly everything he had left. Tracers arced upward and fell short by 50 yards. The bomber vanished into cloud to the north. The guns went silent. Empty. All 1,440 rounds expended in less than 15 minutes. Almost immediately, warning lights flared across the instrument panel. Oil pressure dropped sharply. Temperature needles crept into the red. Sweat looked forward at the engine cowling. The paint was blistering, bubbling from the heat. Only then did he realize what else had happened. The valve's rear gunner must have scored hits during the dive. His oil cooler was damaged. Black smoke began pouring from the engine compartment. Thick, oily smoke, not the pale vapor of coolant. The temperature climbed relentlessly. 210 degrees. 220. 230. At 240, the engine seized. The propeller froze in place. The sudden silence was shocking. After 15 minutes of gunfire, engines, wind, and explosions, there was nothing but the thin whistle of air over torn metal. Sweat was 3 miles from Henderson Field, flying a crippled Wildcat with a dead engine, a shattered wing, and fuel streaming into the slipstream. The aircraft began sinking immediately, 500 feet per minute, then 700. With the asymmetric drag, the Wildcat couldn't glide well. It was too heavy, too damaged. He had 2 choices: try to reach Henderson Field, or ditch. At this descent rate, he would barely cover a mile. Henderson was impossible. He looked down at the water. The harbor was cluttered with ships, wreckage, and debris from the battle. Far too dangerous. Then he spotted a stretch of open water north of WWII Island. Calm by comparison. Clear of traffic. That would have to do. He turned toward it, trading his remaining altitude for position. The Wildcat slid downward through 1,000 feet. 800. 600. Sweat ran the ditching checklist from memory. Canopy open, already done. Harness tight, check. Radio. He keyed the mic and transmitted his position one last time. No response. The radio was likely dead. He loosened his oxygen mask, but left it hanging around his neck. At 400 feet, a jolt of cold realization hit him. He'd forgotten something critical. The canopy. An open canopy would catch water on impact and flip the aircraft upside down. He reached up, released the locks. The plexiglass tore free instantly, ripped away by the slipstream, and tumbling backward into the sky. 200 feet. The water rushed up fast now. Sweat eased the stick back, holding the nose slightly high, tail down, bracing for impact. The tail hit first, just as the instructors had drilled into him during training. Even so, the force of the impact was brutal. The sudden deceleration hurled him forward against the shoulder harness. His face slammed into the instrument panel. He felt the break instantly, sharp, blinding pain as his nose shattered. Blood flooded down his face and into his oxygen mask. The Wildcat skipped once across the surface, then settled heavily into the water. Seawater surged into the cockpit at once. The aircraft was sinking fast. Sweat released his shoulder harness and tried to stand. He couldn't. Something had him pinned. He looked down and realized the problem too late. His parachute had partially deployed during the ditching. The shroud lines had spilled everywhere, looping around his legs, the control stick, the seat frame. He was tangled. Water climbed past his knees, his waist, his chest. He clawed at the lines, pulling desperately, but every movement only cinched them tighter. The Wildcat's nose dipped forward as the engine compartment flooded. The aircraft began sliding beneath the surface. Water reached his neck. He sucked in one final breath just before the sea closed over his head. Underwater, the world dissolved into darkness and confusion. The parachute canopy had bloomed partially and wrapped around him like a suffocating shroud. He couldn't see. He couldn't breathe. His lungs burned almost immediately. His hands scrabbled at his belt until his fingers found the handle of his survival knife. Standard issue. Still there. He pulled it free and began sawing at the nylon lines. One cut. Another. The lines were thick and resistant, the blade hard to control underwater. His chest tightened. Panic clawed at the edges of his mind. 3 lines. 4. His vision narrowed. Darkness crept in from the sides. 5. 6. He was running out of time. 7. Suddenly, the tension vanished. The lines slackened. He was free. He kicked upward with everything he had. His Mae Westlife vest was still deflated. He hadn't had time to inflate it before going under. His boots were full of water, dragging him down. His flight suit felt impossibly heavy. He kicked again, and again. At last his head burst through the surface. He gasped violently, sucking in air mixed with blood and seawater. He coughed, choked, flailed, forcing himself to tread water. His nose throbbed with pain. Breathing through it was impossible. He could only gulp air through his mouth. He reached for the CO2 toggles on his Mae West and pulled. Nothing. He yanked again. Still nothing. The inflation system had failed. He was floating in full flight gear with no working flotation device. WWII Island lay in the distance, perhaps half a mile away. Too far to drift. Too far to wait. His flight boots, designed for carrier decks, were waterlogged and heavy. His leather jacket clung to him, soaked and dragging him down. Every few seconds a wave washed over his face. He swallowed salt water and coughed, fighting to stay upright. Blood continued to stream from his broken nose, mixing with the sea. Then he remembered the one-man life raft. Standard issue, packed into a pouch attached to his parachute harness. He reached behind his back, found the pack, and pulled the inflation lanyard. Nothing happened. He pulled harder. Still nothing. The CO2 cartridge had likely been damaged during the crash or corroded after months in tropical humidity. The raft was dead weight. He was alone. No flotation. No raft. Overhead, the battle still raged. Wildcats streaked north chasing the remaining bombers. Anti-aircraft fire thundered from the ships. No one was looking for downed pilots yet. Stopping the raid came first. He had no choice. WWII Island was his only hope. He began swimming, using a slow side stroke to conserve energy. Every third stroke, he had to stop and tread water just to breathe. His broken nose made each breath shallow and painful. After 5 minutes, he had covered perhaps 100 yards, a quarter of the distance. His arms burned. His legs cramped. The leather jacket was pulling him under. He stopped swimming and struggled out of it. The jacket slipped free and sank immediately. Next came the flight suit. He couldn't get out of the flight suit completely, but he managed to peel it down to his waist. The soaked fabric loosened its grip just enough to make a difference. It wasn't freedom, but it was survival. He started swimming again. Another 100 yards. Maybe less. He stopped, floating on his back for a few seconds, chest heaving. Each breath was shallow and ragged, pulled through a mouth that tasted of salt and blood. The steady stream from his shattered nose continued, dark red spreading into the water around him, an invitation he knew the ocean never ignored. The first shark came up from below. He saw it clearly, a long gray shape materializing from the blue depths, 8 feet at least. A reef shark, most likely. It passed beneath him at 15 feet, turned lazily, then slipped back into the dark. Sweat forced himself to stay calm. Panic would kill him faster than blood loss. Splashing would seal it. He resumed swimming, slow and deliberate. No frantic kicks. No sudden movements. Just controlled strokes toward WWII. counting each one in his head to stay focused. 2 minutes later, the shark returned. This time it brought company. Two more shapes appeared beneath him, circling wider, then tighter. Their movements were unhurried, curious rather than aggressive. Not hunting yet. Watching. Testing. He kept moving. By the time Gavutu was only 200 yards away, his body finally betrayed him. His arms stopped responding. Not weak, unresponsive. His legs dragged uselessly beneath him. He was no longer swimming so much as drifting forward, buoyed only by the air trapped in the remaining folds of his flight suit. The sharks closed in, 10 feet below now. He tried to kick, to scare them off, but there was nothing left. His muscles refused the command. His vision began to tunnel, the edges dimming as if someone were closing curtains around the world. He was going to die within sight of land. Either he would slip under quietly, or something would pull him down. Then he heard it. An engine. At first he thought it was another hallucination, like the false horizons pilots saw when oxygen ran low. But the sound grew louder, uneven, unmistakably close. A voice shouted, "American." He tried to turn his head toward the sound. His neck wouldn't move. He tried to answer, but all that came out was a weak, choking cough. Hands grabbed him under the arms. Strong hands. They lifted him clear of the water in one hard pull and dragged him over the gunwale. He hit the deck of the boat and lay there gasping, chest jerking violently as he sucked in air. Blood and seawater poured from his mouth and nose. "Easy, easy," someone said. "Coast Guard." One of the men knelt beside him, fast and efficient, running practiced hands over his body. Broken nose. Bruising everywhere. Possible concussion. Severe exhaustion. Near drowning. But alive. Sweat tried to sit up. The man pushed him back down firmly. "Don't move. You're done." The boat turned toward Tulagi and opened the throttle. The engine roared. The ride took only minutes, but Sweat remembered none of it clearly, just fragments of sky, metal, and motion. They tied up at a dock where a Navy medical corpsman waited with a stretcher. Sweat waved it away. "I can walk," he said, though his legs shook badly. The corpsman let him try. Inside the medical tent, the corpsman cleaned the blood from his face and examined his injuries. The nose was unmistakably broken, almost certainly from when his face had smashed into the instrument panel during the ditching. Gauze packed his nostrils. Bandages wrapped his head until he barely recognized himself in the reflection of a metal locker. Morphine was offered. Sweat shook his head. "No," he said. "I want to stay awake." The corpsman nodded. The corpsman stepped away, already moving toward another wounded man. The tent was filling quickly now. Burned sailors from the ships in Tulagi Harbor, men coughing black smoke from flak blasts, others silent on stretchers. Whatever had happened in the air might still be happening. Sweat stood up slowly and walked outside. A jeep was idling nearby, its hood dusted white with coral powder. The driver was a Marine Supply sergeant who had watched the fight from the ground, craning his neck as aircraft tore across the sky. "You see the pilot who tore up all those valves?" The sergeant asked casually as Sweat climbed in. Sweat shook his head. The jeep bounced its way back toward Henderson Field, rattling over rough coral roads. Sweat stared straight ahead, hands resting loosely on his knees. His body ached now that the adrenaline was gone. Every bump sent a spike of pain through his face and ribs. The ride took about 20 minutes. It felt like days. They reached the airfield at 11:45 a.m., 75 minutes after Sweat had lifted off that morning. It felt closer to 75 hours. Captain Joe Foss was waiting on the flight line. His Wildcat sat nearby on its hard stand, engine ticking softly as it cooled, gun ports blackened, ammo belts hanging empty. Foss had landed 10 minutes earlier. He saw Sweat climb out of the jeep and walk toward him immediately. Foss stopped a few feet away, eyes taking in the bandaged head, the soaked flight suit, the way Sweat stood just a little too stiff. "You okay?" Foss asked. Sweat nodded. "How many did you get?" Foss asked. Sweat hesitated. 7, he said. "Maybe 8. I'm not sure about the last one." Foss stared at him without speaking. Then he turned and waved over the squadron intelligence officer. First Lieutenant Morrison arrived with a clipboard and a large map of Tulagi Harbor folded under his arm. He led Sweat to a shaded bench and began the debrief immediately. For 30 minutes, Morrison asked precise questions. Time of engagement, altitude, heading, type of aircraft, angle of attack, what Sweat saw when he fired, smoke, fire, Breakup. Impact with water. Sweat answered each one carefully, replaying the fight in his head as best he could. Morrison marked each engagement on the map. The positions lined up perfectly with ship reports, gun camera fragments, and radio calls logged during the raid. When he finished, Morrison counted the marks. 7. Confirmed. He looked up. How old are you, Lieutenant? 22, Sweat said. Morrison wrote it down. How many combat missions before today? None. Morrison paused. He looked up again. Say that again. This was my first combat mission. Morrison slowly set his pencil down. He had been with VMF 221 since its formation. He had debriefed hundreds of sorties. He had seen men become aces over months of combat. He had never heard of anyone scoring 7 kills on their first mission. Word spread fast. By mid-afternoon, pilots were stopping by Henderson Field just to see him. Some clapped him on the shoulder. Some asked him to tell the story again. Others simply stared, trying to reconcile the quiet, blood-streaked lieutenant with what they had just heard. By evening, everyone on Guadalcanal knew the name James Sweat. 7 kills. First mission. Shot down by friendly fire. Ditched in shark-infested water. Pulled out at the last moment. And somehow, still standing. Within days, the story began spreading far beyond Guadalcanal. By the end of the week, naval aviators across the Pacific were hearing versions of it, some accurate, some already drifting toward legend, but the core details never changed. 7 kills. 1 mission. A rookie. 3 days after the battle, the report reached the desk of Admiral William Halsey, commander of all Allied naval forces in the South Pacific. Halsey had read thousands of combat summaries. He knew how unreliable pilot claims could be. In the chaos of air combat, adrenaline blurred judgment, and victories were often overcounted. This one was different. Sweat's claims were supported from every angle. Shipboard observers had watched Val bombers disintegrate through binoculars. Other pilots had seen aircraft fall out of formation, trailing fire. Anti-aircraft crews logged crashes at precisely the locations Sweat described. 7 Japanese dive bombers had gone down within visual range of the fleet, all within a 15-minute span. Gun camera footage would have made it airtight, but the F-4 Wildcat carried none. It didn't matter. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Halsey recognized what he was looking at. On April 10th, just 3 days after the engagement, he personally recommended First Lieutenant James Sweat for the Medal of Honor. The citation emphasized the unprecedented nature of the action. 7 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed in a single sortie, sustained under overwhelming odds, followed by survival after being shot down by friendly fire while defending the fleet. The recommendation moved rapidly up the chain of command, through Nimitz, through Washington, to the Secretary of the Navy. Final approval required the President's signature. Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the authorization on September 24, 1943. 2 weeks later, on October 10th, Sweat stood on a makeshift parade ground at Espiritu Santo as Admiral Halsey himself presented the medal. War correspondents crowded close. Cameras flashed. Sweat stood stiffly, uncomfortable with the attention, his expression unchanged. The story exploded back home. Newspapers across the United States ran front-page features. Life magazine published a multi-page spread with photographs of the young Marine pilot who had become an ace in 15 minutes. To a war-weary public in 1943, Sweat's story was everything they needed, proof that skill, courage, and nerve could still turn the tide. Among pilots, his name took on a different meaning. To pull a Jimmy Sweat became shorthand for achieving the impossible in a single mission. In training squadrons, instructors used his fight as an example. Cadets memorized the engagement. 7 kills became the benchmark no one expected to reach, but everyone dreamed about. Sweat never chased the reputation. He returned to VMF 221 and kept flying combat missions from Henderson Field. As the campaign pushed north, he followed. New airstrips, new skies, new enemies. He fought again and again, no longer a rookie, no longer anonymous. By August 1943, his tally stood at 15.5 confirmed victories. But none of them would ever eclipse what happened on April 7th, the day a first-time combat pilot met the largest Japanese air raid since Midway and survived it. The half credit on his score came from a bomber that 2 pilots attacked simultaneously, their gunfire striking almost at the same moment. It was the only shared victory on his record. Everything else was his alone. Before the war moved on, Sweat would be shot down twice more. The first time came over Vella La Vella in the Solomon Islands. His aircraft was hit during an interception and forced down, but he survived the landing and was recovered quickly. The second shoot-down was far worse. Over Rabaul, Japanese fire crippled his fighter and sent him into the jungle. He survived the crash, evaded enemy patrols, and spent 3 days moving through dense rainforest with little food and no clear sense of direction. On the third day, friendly islanders found him. They hid him, fed him, and eventually paddled him back toward Allied lines in a dugout canoe under cover of darkness. Late in 1943, Sweat was rotated back to the United States. Instead of more combat, he was assigned to instructor duty at Naval Air Station Jacksonville in Florida. There, he trained new fighter pilots heading for the Pacific. He passed on lessons learned the hard way: attack from above and behind whenever possible, fire in short bursts to conserve ammunition, never chase a damaged enemy all the way to the water where you become exposed. He warned them about friendly fire near ships, about always knowing their fuel state, about never losing awareness of where the nearest friendly airfield lay. Above all, he stressed one principle again and again: stay calm. Panic, he told them, killed more pilots than enemy bullets. After the war ended in August 1945, Sweat remained in the Marine Corps Reserve. He continued flying, transitioning to newer aircraft as aviation evolved. During the Korean War, he flew F-4U Corsairs, though he did not see combat in that conflict. He remained in uniform until 1970, retiring from the Marine Corps Reserve with the rank of colonel. By then, he had logged more than 5,000 hours in military aircraft. He settled in Northern California and lived quietly. He rarely spoke about the Medal of Honor or the events of April 7, 1943. When asked, he brushed it aside with the same explanation every time: right place, right time, good training, and a lot of luck. James Sweat died on January 15, 2009, at the age of 88. He was buried with full military honors at Quantico National Cemetery in Virginia. Hundreds attended the funeral: Marines, naval aviators, family members, and pilots who had trained under him or studied his tactics. During the service, the Medal of Honor citation was read aloud. It detailed his actions on April 7 in precise, unemotional language: 7 enemy aircraft destroyed, continued combat despite damage, successful ditching, and survival. The citation closed with words that summed up his entire career: extraordinary heroism and complete disregard for his own safety. The Japanese raid on Tulagi that day became the last major air offensive of the Solomon Islands campaign. Japan lost 42 aircraft. American losses totaled 7 fighters. Sweat alone accounted for roughly 1/6 of the enemy's losses. His impact lasted far beyond that morning. Flight instructors across the Marine Corps used his engagement as a teaching model for the rest of the war. Attack decisively. Conserve ammunition. Maintain situational awareness. Take calculated risks, but never reckless ones. These principles became standard doctrine for Marine fighter training. Perhaps the most important lesson was the simplest. Sweat had faced 150 enemy aircraft with fewer than 200 flight hours. Training, discipline, and calm execution, not experience alone, had carried him through. He had never fired his guns in combat before that morning. Not once. And yet when the moment came, his actions were precise, disciplined, and instinctively correct. The realization struck commanders afterward with uncomfortable clarity. Experience mattered, but preparation mattered more. That conclusion reshaped how the Navy and Marine Corps trained fighter pilots for the rest of the war. Gunnery training was expanded and intensified. Tactical decision-making under stress became a priority. Training flights grew harsher, more realistic, designed to force pilots to think clearly while overloaded, fatigued, and surprised. Sweat's performance became proof that mastery built in training could carry a pilot through chaos when combat finally arrived. The F-4F Wildcat Sweat flew that day is long gone, resting somewhere beneath the waters of Tulagi Harbor. But his legacy did not sink with it. At Marine Corps University in Quantico, his April 7th mission is still studied as part of air combat doctrine. The National Museum of the Marine Corps displays his Medal of Honor and flight gear. Aviation historians continue to cite his 7 victories in 15 minutes as one of the most extraordinary achievements in aerial warfare, not simply for the numbers, but for the circumstances surrounding them. First combat mission. Overwhelming numerical odds. Damage from friendly fire. A forced ditching. Near drowning. Survival against every statistical expectation. Sweat's story answered a question every military organization eventually faces. Can training overcome inexperience? Can preparation substitute for time in combat? His answer was unambiguous. Yes. During those 15 minutes over Tulagi, Sweat made dozens of rapid decisions. When to attack, from what angle, how long to fire, when to break off, how to conserve ammunition, how to escape, how to ditch a crippled aircraft. None were reckless. None were random. Each reflected deliberate training executed under maximum pressure. Over time, the phrase "to do a Jimmy Sweat" faded from everyday use as World War II veterans aged and passed on. But within marine aviation, the story endured. New pilots still learn his name. They still study that morning in April 1943. They still hear about the calm under fire, the tactical precision, the refusal to panic even as his aircraft burned and sank beneath him. Those qualities defined more than a single mission. They defined a career that spanned decades, 3 conflicts, and thousands of flight hours. 7 bombers fell from the sky above Tulagi in 15 minutes. A 22-year-old Marine pilot on his first combat sortie put them there. That is not just a story about one day in 1943. It is a story about what becomes possible when training, courage, and determination align perfectly, and about a standard that continues to challenge every Marine pilot who straps into a fighter cockpit today.